Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into a deeply tragic, highly complex case analysis from 1993. It involves 13-year-old Eric Smith, who killed a 4-year-old child named Derek Roby in a wooded area in Savona, New York. Now, before we even start unpacking the psychology here, it's absolutely crucial that we center the reality of this event. Derek Roby was a 4-year-old boy. He wasn't just some detail in a clinical profile. His family's loss is the profound human consequence right at the heart of this case. So our purpose today isn't to glamorize the offender, and we certainly aren't diagnosing from afar. Instead, we're going to conduct a rigorous case analysis of the high-profile forensic frameworks that evaluators actually use when they're trying to understand the incomprehensible. Okay, let's dive into this. This case immediately hits us with a central forensic mystery, something experts wrestle with constantly. When a young person commits a genuinely extreme violent act, how do evaluators actually determine intent, right? Like, did the violence happen because of a sudden, explosive loss of emotional control? Or was it purposeful, organized criminal behavior? Figuring this out isn't just clinical curiosity. It fundamentally changes how the legal system responds, and it dictates the entire course of justice. The conflict in the Eric Smith trial was incredibly stark. On one side, you had a defense psychiatrist who diagnosed Smith with intermittent explosive disorder, arguing that the killing was connected to an uncontrollable eruption of aggression. But on the other side, the prosecution vehemently challenged this. They argued that Smith's actions demonstrated intentional, deliberate murder. And it is so vital to remember here that a psychological diagnosis offered in a courtroom is an expert opinion. It is not an absolute, established legal fact that a judge or jury is just magically forced to accept. It's essentially an argument about how to interpret behavior. To really grasp the defense's angle, we have to look closely at intermittent explosive disorder, or IED. What is it really? Well, it's an impulse control disorder. It represents a genuine clinical failure to regulate aggressive impulses. We are not just talking about someone having a casual bad temper or being generally irritable. We're talking about outbursts of aggression, whether verbal, physical, or destructive, where the intensity of the reaction is grossly disproportionate to whatever stressor or provocation actually triggered it. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the strict boundary of these diagnostic criteria. For an outburst to qualify under IED, it literally must be impulsive or anger-based. Crucially, the violence cannot be instrumental. That means it can't be planned to get money, secure power, seek revenge, or to cover up a crime. It also has to cause significant real-world impairment, like severe distress or major legal problems. So if the aggression is used as a tool for some tangible gain, that fundamentally rules out IED. And here is a critical rule of thumb in forensic psychology: one single offense. Just one. No matter how explosive or incredibly violent it looks, one offense is never enough to establish an IED diagnosis. Evaluators can't just look at the charged crime in a vacuum. They have to look at the person's entire behavioral history to find a recurring pattern. Were there previous disproportionate outbursts? How long did they last? What triggered them? You simply cannot diagnose IED based on one terrible day. Which brings us to a really brilliant distinction that evaluators have to make: the difference between IID and conduct disorder. If you look at IID, the behavior is episodic and impulsive. It's a pure failure to regulate impulses, and the outbursts are anchored in sudden anger. Conduct disorder, however, is a persistent pattern of violating the rights of others or major social rules. In conduct disorder, aggression isn't always some wild loss of control. It can be entirely purposeful and instrumental. A young person might use violence very specifically to establish dominance, retaliate against someone, or avoid consequences. Applying those clinical definitions directly to our case analysis of Eric Smith reveals exactly why this trial was so hotly contested. The defense built their theory around accumulated anger. They noted Smith had experienced severe bullying and social struggles, so they framed the murder as an explosive loss of control. Now, impartially speaking, while bullying obviously impacts emotional development, most bullied children never become violent offenders. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused intensely on the sequence of actions, specifically Smith's deliberate efforts to conceal his responsibility after the crime. They argued those sequential, organized choices pointed far away from a brief, impulsive explosion. But what about his other diagnoses, right? Complicating the clinical picture, other accounts noted diagnoses of ADHD and depression for Smith. Now, it's absolutely true that ADHD involves impulsivity and frustration intolerance. And it is also true that childhood depression frequently manifests as irritability or anger rather than just sadness. However, neither of these conditions ordinarily produces extreme violence. Evaluators have to be incredibly careful. They can't just accumulate a bunch of complex psychological labels and stack them up to try and explain away a homicide. Every single diagnosis has to bring distinct, well-supported evidence to the table. So the crucial point is this. Colloquially, in everyday life, we often hear that violent offenders have anger issues. But in a forensic setting, anger is an emotion. It's not an explanation. Anger is present in everything from ordinary human conflict to mood disorders to substance intoxication. Furthermore, a person can appear intensely angry while purposefully using aggression to frighten or control someone else. Evaluators must distinguish between emotional arousal and actual behavioral purpose. This brings us to a phrase you hear constantly in true crime discussions. I'm sure you know it. He just snapped. But is violence ever truly that sudden? That phrase often conceals far more than it actually explains. It creates this myth that violent behavior just materializes out of absolute nowhere, completely devoid of prior choices, escalating threats, or mental rehearsal. To cut through the myth of snapping, psychologists use a rigorous process called forensic reconstruction. They absolutely do not walk into an evaluation assuming the crime was either a masterfully planned event or a total uncontrollable explosion. Instead of assumptions, they meticulously rebuild the behavioral pathway. They function almost like behavioral detectives. Their ultimate goal is to see which clinical diagnosis actually fits the complete behavioral evidence. They do this by looking at a micro timeline. They ask, okay, what was happening days before? Were there grievances? Did they acquire weapons? What about the exact minutes prior? Were there identifiable triggers or choices made that could have stopped it? What happened during the incident itself? Were obvious opportunities to walk away just ignored? And vitally, what happened immediately afterward? If a person takes deliberate steps to hide their crime, it changes the picture entirely. An impulsive beginning to a crime does not automatically mean that subsequent, calculated efforts to conceal it were involuntary. Which leads us to the critical boundary between psychology and the law. A psychiatric loss of emotional control is not the same thing as legal incapacity. Even if a person truly suffers from intermittent explosive disorder, that intense anger or reduced self-control doesn't automatically strip them of their capacity to understand that their action is illegal. A person can act impulsively and still entirely possess criminal intent. Let's move to and see how this builds into our core forensic takeaways for this analysis. First, true IED requires a recurring pattern of impulsive outbursts. One act is never, ever enough. Second, we have to distinguish between IED as a genuine failure of control and conduct disorder as a persistent pattern of purposeful rule breaking. Finally, and definitely most importantly for the justice system, a psychological diagnosis does not dictate a legal verdict. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful anchor. Explanation is not exoneration. Understanding the psychological why behind a devastating action, whether that involves bullying, impulsivity, or depression, does not erase an offender's legal responsibility. The jury in Eric Smith's case heard all the competing psychological explanations, and they still convicted him of intentional second-degree murder. The diagnosis illuminated the context, but it absolutely did not excuse the crime. So we've explored how experts separate impulse control from purposeful conduct. But what happens when violent behavior occurs alongside a profound break from reality? How do evaluators distinguish extreme delinquency and anger from genuine hallucinations and paranoid beliefs? Think about that as we look ahead to our next case analysis on Kip Kinkle and ask ourselves, when exactly does adolescent misconduct cross the line into actual psychosis?